Welcome back to Business Ethics. I'm Tom, and today we are talking about deontology. Okay, deontology is another kind of major camp in ethical theory, and deontology actually, the term is translated as the study of duty or obligation, right? Just like zoology or biology, deontology, the deon refers to our sense of duty or obligation, right? Now, one of the best ways to kind of introduce this, since we've already talked about consequentialism, is to bring up what's known as the trolley problem, right? This is a very famous ethical thought experiment, and the trolley problem is this kind of thought experiment where you have a trolley going down track, right? There's a main track, and there are four people on that track, and they are going to get hit by that trolley and they are going to die, right? And they can't see you, they can't see the trolley, but you happen to be at a switch track, right? And at the switch where you can pull the switch and put the trolley on the switch track, right? And on the switch track, there's one person, and that one person also can't see you, can't hear the trolley, they're not going to move, there's no way for you to get in contact with them. And you have to make a choice, right? Do you flip the switch and kill the one person to save four? Or do you not intervene and let the four people die in order to not basically intentionally kill one person, right? The idea is that this is supposed to tease out your ethical intuitions, right? Obviously, if your intuition is that the right answer is to pull the switch, right? That obviously you want to lessen the amount of overall harm. That means that you are a consequentialist, right? Because it means that you are determining what the right thing to do is based on the consequences your action produces, right? Sacrificing the one person for the to save four is promoting the greater good, right? You can do that calculus pretty quick. But if your intuition is that it's not up to you to intentionally sacrifice one person, right, in order to save others, then you might be a deontologist, right? Immanuel Kant is probably the most famous deontologist, and he kind of lays out his initial position really in groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, right? And Kant, he believes that really the way to understand the moral worth of our actions is to understand them in terms of the intentions that they're based on, right? And specifically, not just like having good intentions in a general way, but specifically a kind of principled action, right? Really, to understand Kant, what he wants is he thinks your action has moral worth when you do the right thing for the right reasons, right? Really, the kind of character of this is that Kant's going to think that, like, for example, you should be honest, not because of some consequences that it will produce, but because it's the right thing to do, basically, right? You shouldn't steal because stealing's wrong, and that's it, right? It's very much that kind of principled way of acting, right? And so really it is the principles upon which you act that determine the moral worth of your action, right? Now, Kant sets his reading up different from Mill, right? He basically kind of motivates this view of deontology, the idea that it's our intentions that determine the moral worth of our actions. And then he kind of gives his grand principle, which is called the categorical imperative, at the end of this, right? He starts off by saying that only a good will is good without qualification, right? This is a very strong claim. What does it mean? Well, one way to think about this is to think about lots of things that you think are good, right? Maybe you think water is good, you drink it every day. Maybe you think food is good. Maybe you think music is good, right? These kinds of things. There are many things that we think are good. But the idea is that those are actually, if Kant is right, that only a good will is good without qualification, then those things that I just listed are all good with qualification, right? What does that mean? Well, water, it can be bad, right? You can drown in water. You can actually die from overhydration, right? Too much water or bad water, if you have water that's not clean, right, can make you sick. Water is good with certain caveats, right? And that's what we usually mean when we mean water is good, right? Food is good with certain caveats, right? Because you can't have too much or the wrong kind. And same with, you might say, like music or TV, right? Music is good, but there's bad music and so on and so forth. Right. He thinks a goodwill is the only thing that's good without qualification. It's good in and of itself, right? Now, the catch with this is that a goodwill, as we'll see, is one that acts based on principles, right? It's not just someone who has good intentions, as I mentioned. It's someone who does the right thing because it is right and for no other reason, right? So he has a very specific idea of what a goodwill is, right? But to motivate this idea that it is the will that really determines the moral worth of our actions, he considers a number of different claims, right? Three specific things that kind of narrow this down and bolster this claim. The first one is that virtues can be used to do evil. What does this mean? Well, virtues, things like patience, things like courage, things like honesty, things like perseverance, things like intelligence. He mentions wit, these kinds of things are all things that can be used to do very bad stuff, right? And the way I like to think about this is, if you think about kind of like your favorite bad guy or villain, right? They tend to exemplify certain virtues, right? Villains can oftentimes be very, very smart, right? And they use that intelligence to be better at doing bad things, right? Villains are oftentimes courageous, right? And they use that courage to do bad stuff, right? It's so Kant's point is that these virtues, which are oftentimes taken to be markers of what it is to be a good person, can be used to do all kinds of bad stuff, right? So they're not good in and of themselves. They need to be good only in the context of being used by a goodwill, someone with good intentions, right? He also mentions that a person that lacks an ability, right, still can have moral worth. They can have good character, right? What does this mean? Well, just because you're in a position where you can't produce a lot of good in the world does not make you a bad person, right? So the example I always like to give is, you can imagine someone who works for like Doctors Without Borders or something like this, does lots and lots of good for lots and lots of people, saving lives, and on a mission they suffer a horrible accident and now they're bedridden, right? We tend to think that accident does not diminish their moral worth. But if we were focused on how much good they can produce, right, how many consequences they can produce, then we might think that actually their moral worth has diminished. But Kant thinks that it's not quite right, right? And the last thing is that he claims that rational use of the will is necessary to be ethical, right? Or to have kind of like ethical obligations, to be able to have moral responsibility, right? Which he thinks is like the crux of our moral evaluation, right? What does this mean? Well, he mentions that he kind of considers happiness. We've talked about happiness, and he thinks that really you can pursue happiness without reason and without responsibility, right? So, like an animalistic pleasure, right? An animal can pursue the satisfaction of their instincts, right? By looking for food, looking for a mate, looking for shelter, or whatever it is, right? They don't really need reason. They kind of just do those things and respond to the environment. Whereas when it comes to doing the right thing, right, it seems like you need intentionality, right? You need to be able to act based on reasons, right? You need to be able to think about the consequences of your actions or the import of your actions, and then act in light of that kind of thing, and appreciation for responsibilities to others and this kind of thing. And we tend to only evaluate someone's action as having moral worth if they had a choice, right? And they chose to do the right thing. Right? If you don't have a choice, we tend to think that's accidental. It's not someone's not morally responsible in those cases, right? And so this all kind of points to this idea that it is the will, the use of the will, that is really what is essential in evaluating the moral worth of someone's action, right? He also makes a further kind of distinction, which is really important, which is the idea of acting in accordance with duty versus acting from duty, or acting for the sake of duty, right? What does this mean? Well, acting in accordance with duty is kind of doing the right thing in a case where it also serves your self-interest, right? So I don't lie to the cops because I don't want to go to jail, right? Because I don't want to get caught in the lie or something like this. I did the right thing, I was honest, but I didn't really do it for the right reasons, right? Versus acting for the sake of duty, which would be, telling the truth because it's the right thing to do, right? It is the second that Kant thinks has moral worth, right? The first does not. He thinks just because you happen to do the right thing, but you're doing it out of self-interest, your action has no moral worth, right? It's only when you do the right thing for the right reasons that your action really has moral worth, right? And so this all leads to you say, okay, well, doing the right thing for the right reasons is the thing that has moral worth. The question is, well, what is the right thing, right? And what are the right reasons, right? So that's determined by Kant's categorical imperative, right? So this idea is that one should act only in such a way that your personal policy can be made a universal law, right? Or a universal policy. So the idea is that, if my personal policy is something that I do, if I can make it universal, right? If it is universalizable, right? Then it is right, right? And if I can't make it a universal rule, then it is wrong, right? So only when policies can pass the categorical imperative, it's kind of a test of universalizability, then they are right, right? So this sounds kind of like odd, but if you start to use some examples, it starts to crystallize pretty quick. The examples that he gives, I mean, the first one is the issue of honesty, right? So if my personal policy is that I lie whenever it serves my self-interest, and I try to make that a universal policy, this gets very sticky really quickly, right? So my policy is that I lie whenever it serves my self-interest. And if everyone adopts this policy, right, then it looks like I actually can't be successful in a lie when it is everyone's policy, right? Because if everyone lies, then I can't really trick someone into thinking that I'm being honest, right? Because everyone lies all the time, and then there's no presumption of honesty, right? You lose that presumption of honesty, and that's the way a lie works, right? I can only really kind of get over on someone if they trust me. If there's a presumption that I'm telling the truth, right? Then I can kind of tell a lie and be successful with it and get someone to kind of buy into my lie. And so the idea is that lying is not a policy that can be made universal. It actually cannot be a universal policy, right? The idea is that it is by its very nature the exception to the rule, right? Because lying only works if we assume people are telling the truth. right? He also, you can also do this with stealing, right? If my policy is that whenever I see something that's bright and shiny, I steal it, right? And I try to make that a universal policy. Well, if that's everyone's policy, then everyone kind of takes whatever they want whenever they want it, and then we kind of lose the kind of presumption of property, right? Um, Things don't really belong to others. Everyone just takes everything from everyone else. And if there's no presumption of property, right, or respect for people's property, then you actually can't steal, right? Because what you're doing is just taking stuff, but everyone's taking stuff. So there's no way to really do what we would consider stealing, which is taking something that belongs to someone else, right? Because nothing really belongs to anyone if it's made a universal policy, right? So again, stealing only works as the exception to the rule, which means that it does not pass this test of universalizability. It cannot be a universal law. It always has to be kind of breaking of a policy or breaking of a law. And Kant thinks this is really rooted in reason. This is kind of teasing out these categories. And so this test of the categorical imperative is kind of teasing out these um, implied rules that we kind of assume in our being part of a society, right? And so he thinks we're kind of teasing out um, um, the obligations that we have, right? And so this is the way the categorical imperative is supposed to work. It's very kind of absolute, right? And the last thing that I will say about this is that one thing that kind of falls out of this categorical imperative is these kind of absolute principles of respect for others, right? Along the lines of the categorical imperative, it's always wrong to manipulate another person, right? To use someone as what you say, a means to an end. Right. So the reason why is because if my policy is to use other people to pursue my interests, then and I make that a universal policy, then everyone's kind of manipulating everyone else, and then no one really is able to kind of be successful in manipulating another person, right? Because everyone's kind of manipulating everyone else, and no one's kind of in charge, right? Um, One person has to be kind of subordinate to another in order for manipulation to work, right? So based on that, we always have this kind of absolute obligation to respect the autonomy of others, right? And this means that for Kant, it is never okay to use another person at all, right? And so Kant really has the framework, and this deontological framework is really the kind of basis for a very kind of absolutist view of like human rights, which is very intuitive. Right. So for human rights, we think that we don't torture people who are like, say, prisoners of war, not because of the consequences, but because it's just wrong to do that to another human being, right? We don't starve people because that's just inhumane. End of story. Doesn't matter if they're a serial killer. It doesn't matter what they did, how horrific or how little. Every human beings deserves like a certain degree of respect, right? This is a very Kantian kind of view, right? And this very much ties into business because there are lots of policies in the business world where we tend to think that they should be absolute in their nature, right? Like, for example, sexual harassment, right? We tend to think that it's just wrong, right? Like everybody deserves to feel safe in the workplace. End of story, right? It's not a weighing the pros and cons. It's just that's the way it is, right? That's what a person deserves as an individual. Right. And things like child labor, this kind of stuff, right? We tend to just think it's just wrong, right? And so Kant really has the kind of the framework for this kind of response, which is very different than the kind of consequentialist view that we're always kind of weighing the pros and cons. That's right. That is deontology in a nutshell. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk with you all soon.